So up first, we'll have Jean Ritoul from Spectra, Mindseye Biomedical, to share with us her open-sourced biomedical imaging device.
Okay, great. Hello, everybody, and welcome to Spectra Open Source Biomedical Imaging. It's an open source gateway to move medical imaging forward. The overriding question is, what if biomedical imaging was accessible, just like the computer started out taking out entire rooms? The true revolution happened when we got the personal computer and people started hacking with it and experimenting with it. And then eventually we got tiny phones that everybody has, everybody in the world, and it's revolutionized communication. There's been a .com boom, the internet. It's changed everything about our lives. And I'd like to see the same thing happen with medical imaging. Currently, MRIs are very expensive. They take up a whole room. They have helium quenching chambers. They're not accessible. You'll never play with one unless you're very, very lucky or very, very specialized. Wouldn't it be amazing if we all had access to that? And on the bottom right, I allude to the Star Trek Tricorder, which is the version where we've shrunk it and everybody can see inside their bodies. So it's a bit of an ivory tower with CAT scans costing a few $1 million. And they have ionizing radiation, which means that they cause cancer if you get too many of them. You definitely don't want to be around one for a very long time in close quarters. They take up a whole room again, need dedicated maintenance staff, similar to the MRI, which is a magnificent technology, but so expensive, taking up multiple rooms. And the ultrasound, a medical grade ultrasound is definitely a little bit more portable, but comes in at around about $100,000. And then you've got an EEG, which is important to mention, not because it's a medical imaging tool, but because it's an important diagnostic tool. And a medical grade EEG will cost you around about $40,000. So this is outside of the range of your typical garage experimenter or citizen scientist. Startups are innovating in this area. You've got Hyperfine making a bedside MRI, which is absolutely fantastic. But a bedside MRI is a slightly different use case than a small portable wearable. Butterfly Networks has a low-cost ultrasound, but it's closed source, and it's actually not yet available. And it's also still more expensive. Introducing Spectra. Spectra is a 2-inch squared medical imaging device with a price point under $500. It uses a technique called electrical impedance tomography, which sends small currents at different angles through any conductive body, and then uses the same algorithm as a CAT scan to reconstruct an image. On the right here, you can see a typical test setup where we have a cup which is being rotated in a tank. And just using current, we're able to reconstruct the exact spatial localization of where that cup is. On the bottom left, you can see what happens when we put 2 cups in the tank. You can see exactly where they are. This is important because this technique uses really tiny currents, so small that they're within the IEC's guidelines for safe use on humans, meaning that you can just do the same thing on your body, sitting at your desk with this tiny device, which is Bluetooth enabled. So here I wrapped Spectra around my thorax and was able to reconstruct an image of my lungs safely. I've compared it to a CAT scan image on the bottom left, and you can see it's lower resolution, which is true. However, it's not limited to lung imaging. You can measure any physical change, like bladder changes, perhaps stomach changes, alongside your lung changes. You can also measure long-term muscle changes or long-term fat changes. Any change in a material can be measured, or short-term gestural recognition of muscle changes in a cross-section of your wrist. Since Tool Foundry started, we have executed and delivered our crowdfunding campaign. That means that everybody who backed our campaign now has a Spectra device in their hands. And just to remind you about what the first MRI scan looked like in 1977 of lungs, it was over there on the left. It's pretty low resolution. And a more recent one on the bottom left, which is actually my own brain when I was working at UCSF. And it's much better. It came a long way. So what would happen if we could do the same thing with this technique? This technique is quite different because an MRI has always needed a big magnet and a helium quenching chamber, whereas this technique doesn't need anything like that. It can very cheaply be mass-produced, and that's powerful. So you might be wondering about my background. So I've got about 15 years experience in biosensor wearables, including founding a medical device startup called Lear Scientific, which focused on neurogenic bladder disorder. It was backed by SOS Ventures and part of the HACS accelerator. I've had previous experience scaling a team as a co-founder of Good Parents, which is a biosensor wearable focused on children that raised about $6.5 million. I was a key part of Basis, which is another biosensor wristwatch company that was later acquired by Intel and produced over 40,000 units. Also a key part of Emotive, which is a low-cost EEG system. So that's actually still available now. You can just go out and buy one right now. I've also been published in Nature through my time at Ghazali Lab in a study on brain training. So what would happen if there was a safe form of medical imaging that people could hack with and improve themselves? For one, I think people would be more curious about their own bodies and learning about them. And I think that would be really valuable. Even if they were just as curious as they are about computers, except with their own body, that would be fantastic. I think people would do preventative healthcare more because it would be easy to get a scan. So you would just do a scan just because you could. Another thing that I think would change would be that so basically, if we could all improve medical imaging together, we would have a great system that everybody could use. You might be wondering what the people who bought Spectra devices are actually doing with them, which is a great question because they're doing a whole range of things. And I want to show that it's encouraging innovation and acceleration of health technologies in a few different areas. So there's Mayo Clinic, which is looking at intracranial pressure monitoring to improve neurosurgery outcomes. There is, on the bottom right, infant lung monitoring, a very important application because you can't put them in a CAT scan because it causes cancer, so you can use this technique. You can use it for a long period of time. A gestural recognition lab is looking at spatial localization for muscle movement because they don't get that information with EMG, which is what they typically use. There's a startup looking at cervical mucus for fertility tracking in women. There's another startup which is looking at a lab on a chip application for embryo analysis. There's a dentist who wants to replace X-rays for cavity detection, which is a really interesting idea by using this same technique. So that's just a couple of the ideas. There's many more. And as you can imagine, that people are pursuing, and that's important. So what are our next steps? We'd like to grow the community and get feedback and make technological improvements so that we can create a better, accessible, and mass manufacturable device so that more people have access to biomedical imaging. A large portion of the world has no access to medical imaging right now, so giving more people access is a huge leap forward. Our vision for the future, how can we continue this effort? It actually doesn't really fit into this standard VC model, unfortunately, because we want to prioritize healthcare outcomes, and we don't necessarily place shareholder returns first. We do value growth, curiosity, and mostly we want medical technology to advance really fast because it's so important to the future of human welfare. And we really need your help. So are there philanthropic investors and organizations that believe safely democratizing medical imaging is important? If so, we would love to chat after the presentations are over downstairs. Feel free to email me at jane@mindseyebiomedical.com. Check out our website or our Twitter, and thank you very much.